Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is Paul, and what I want to do in this video is continue my philosophy of science for scientists, engineers, and researchers, and talk about what is pseudoscience. So if you remember last time, what we tried to do is talk about the demarcation problem. What differentiates science from non-science? But today what we're going to do is talk about something that's very related, but I think it deserves its own video, and that is what is that differentiates pseudoscience from science, because there seems to be something in the word pseudoscience that's different from just, okay, this stuff is just in the domain of science and this stuff isn't. And then pseudoscience, there's this idea of, well, first of all, it's a very loaded term. There's a lot of emotional meaning to it. For instance, when people accuse somebody else of doing pseudoscience, it's a very serious accusation as opposed to, okay, you're just doing non-science. And I think this really comes down to the idea that there's this intuitive notion that there are things that are masquerading as science or trying to be seen as having scientific legitimacy when they don't. And that is the sort of things that differentiates, you have science, you have non-science, and then you have pseudoscience maybe somewhere in the middle where it looks like science or it tries to appear like science, but in actuality it's not. And pseudoscience is especially tough because if you don't have a very clear demarcation criteria, it can kind of go on either end. So yeah, why is it that we need a definition of pseudoscience versus just having science and non-science? And I'm going to take Hansen's definition from 1996. I think he's really well known in philosophy of science, and he's basically saying pseudoscience is this. It's not scientific, which of course is just non-science, but its major proponents try to create the impression that it is scientific. So this is very closely related to the demarcation problem, because this means that we have some idea of demarcating science from non-science, so we can actually point out and say, hey, this stuff appears to be science, or it acts like science, or people are pushing it as science, but it isn't. And the thing I want to say too, it doesn't necessarily mean that pseudoscience is false. And we'll talk about the relationship between science and truth perhaps in another video. I think that's really worth talking about. But this particular definition doesn't mean that it's false, rather that it tries to obtain some sort of legitimacy by appearing scientific. And that kind of, we ask the question, do we want our definition of pseudoscience to also include being false? Or do we instead want to just say, no, pseudoscience is something that is just not necessarily in accord with scientific methodology. It just acts like it does, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's false. Because the connection between something following the scientific method and something being true, or that making something seem more true, that's actually a non-obvious sort of connection. I mean, I think it's an intuitive connection, but how strongly you make that claim is something we should talk about too. And the other thing I want to say too is this is important because the word science and the word pseudoscience are both very charged terms. They carry a lot of emotional meaning as well. I think what we end up finding is that people are picking their definitions of pseudoscience post hoc, meaning after the fact. They want their definition of pseudoscience to include the things that they want to call pseudoscience and the things that they don't, rather than they have a nice definition and then they apply it to other things. And we'll talk about this, and we'll talk about a couple definitions. So really what I'm going to do is just go through some of these definitions, but first I want to talk a little bit about the questions of philosophy. So if you imagine philosophy having this huge spectrum of determining what is truth or what is knowledge, all of these sorts of questions are inside of philosophy. And when we're talking about science, what we're talking about is a branch of philosophy called natural philosophy. This is how it historically came about, and it's restricting its scope to a certain set of principles. Now, why do I make this claim here? And then what I would say is pseudoscience could be things that are on the fringes of it, but they're things that pretend that they're in the circle when they actually aren't. I think that's kind of Hansen's definition. Things that aren't necessarily invalid questions or aren't necessarily false, but they're things that are either uninvestigatable by science, or maybe they are false, or maybe people that are peddling pseudoscience are people that are trying to manipulate, or they have a specific political agenda. That's another possibility. So I'm going to say two things. One of these is going to be more controversial than the other. The first thing is, this shouldn't be that controversial, is that by restricting its scope or methodology, by having a criterion of what's in or not, science is only justified to the extent that its philosophical and its not scientific assumptions are justified. So if we say science is the systematic study of the natural world, basically what we're doing is restricting science to the study of the natural world. So if people are claiming that, okay, this thing doesn't exist because science can't investigate it, that's actually begging the question, because claiming that science is restricted to these sorts of things is not a claim, it's not a scientific claim, it's a philosophical one. And the things that are outside of the realm of scientific debate doesn't mean that they're false. It just means that by definition, science can't answer. And the other thing, this is controversial, right? But let's just say it. Science is and likely will always be philosophy's bitch. There are other ways you could say this, but there are a couple reasons for this. First is conceptual. Science is justified through philosophy. Science can't justify its own assumptions or justify that its particular methodology assent to truth. That's a philosophical claim, not a scientific one. Once you basically say science is this particular circle, and then you're trying to say things about whether the things in the circle are true or out of the circle, now you're doing philosophy and not science. And that's why I think talking about philosophy of science is so important. The other is historical, right? Modern science came out of philosophy as a branch of natural philosophy. So science is this sort of subset of natural philosophy in the terms of all the questions that philosophy can ask. And then, of course, there are assumptions that science uses that are philosophical assumptions and that aren't justified by science itself, such as the use of reason or the use of mathematics. These are descriptions that aren't or can't necessarily be justified by science without begging the question or arguing in a circle. So these are things that science assumes to proceed. And basically the status of these things, like, metaphysics or metamathematics, like what is mathematics, is that sort of thing. Those are questions of philosophy and not really investigatable by science because they're dealing with things that are abstract and potentially not, or at least arguably, in or out of the natural world. And then we have the problem of induction, which is basically the idea here, inductive versus deductive reasoning. If I see the sun rise every day, does this give me a reason to trust that it's going to rise tomorrow? Hume brought this up, really, really famous problem. And science sort of assumes or goes on based on the uniformity of nature, at least most of the time, which itself is a philosophical assumption. And the extent to which science or the natural world actually behaves or has behaved this way is an additional assumption that is difficult to justify given the problem of induction. So I just kind of want to leave that out there too. And that's why I want to avoid branches of philosophy being labeled pseudoscience, because it is fair to say, okay, there are all these sorts of things. Like, for instance, most scientists are going to believe that there are like ethical truths, like slavery is wrong, even if that particular question may not be investigatable by science, or at least the content of that question. And I'm talking about this because I want people to understand that just because something isn't in the circle of science per se doesn't mean that it's false, or doesn't mean that people don't believe it or it's not worthwhile. It's just science involves a specific criteria, and then pseudoscience is the stuff that I guess would be considered outside of that but acts like it's in the circle. So let's give a couple common examples, and these are controversial. I mean, anyone who's in any of these groups is going to be like, wait a minute, this isn't like I'm not pseudoscience, I'm actual science. So astrology, apocalypse predictions or codes, aliens, intelligent design, the multiverse hypothesis, sociobiology, and I'll just also add, some theories in theoretical physics or theoretical cosmology as well.